Welcome to Brands of Value, the podcast dedicated to underrated strategies, tactics, and methods of marketing and growth. I am your host, David Göz, and today's expert is Michi Reinicke. Michi is a strategist I've been following for years now and whose work I really appreciate, so I really wanted to pick his brain. He's worked for many companies, among them Philipp and Keuntje, Serviceplan and Elbdudler. However, I got to know him during his time as head of strategy of KNSK and as the managing director of Brand Consultancy, Die Neue Vernunft. Nowadays, Michi is a freelance strategist on a mission to introduce processual brand thinking, an idea we will discuss in today's podcast. Hi, Michi. Welcome to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you what you think value is. What is value to you?
Well, you have had a few guests here already who talked about value, very different ways. And I think that that's the beauty of it, that value can be generated everywhere, that it can come from everywhere. And especially when you talk about brands and brand management and companies and how they create value, there's lots of places to find value, actually. And that's what I try to explore, how to create value through a standardization of certain processes, how you can find value through repetition, and through optimization in how you approach brand management. That's what I do.
So to someone listening to us for the next 40 minutes, what are they gonna get away with? Is there some frameworks? What are we gonna talk about? What is the value to them?
You can take away from talking with me that I have opinions on almost everything regarding marketing and brand management. So maybe that's interesting. I also think that we need to be very clear and very honest about what the quality of brand management is in Germany, especially, and whether we are educated enough to manage our brands in the best way possible. And well, if you want to have a take on how brand management works in our industry, in our country, in various industries, I think it might be interesting to you.
When we talked about what we will talk about today here, we came up with the title, The Hidden Value in Processual Brand Thinking. What is that?
I don't think I can patent it already. I don't think it's an expression that I can use everywhere and people will understand it because it's a little bit technical. I get it. But I think to think about brands as processes and brand management as a process where you have to do certain things after you did certain other things is very valuable to companies. And I think most of the time, people who actually manage brands, and I have to disclaim, I have not worked as a brand manager for a brand before. I always have worked in services industries, consulting with brand managers. And I've seen from the outside what kind of work they are doing. And I think there is a lot of things to do better and to generate more value if you just follow simple processes and if you just follow steps instead of thinking about how to, raise the bar in the next quarter or something like that. And that's why I came up with the processual brand thingy. I think it's very important to understand that my basic assumption is that people address brand management in a way where they talk about pieces of brands. So you have to imagine in Germany, brand managers see their brands as kind of those industrial machines, They are huge. You can't oversee everything, what happens. Sometimes they need a repair. Sometimes you need to put a little bit of oil somewhere so that it works properly. But they see it as a fixed thing, as a thing that's just there when they come to the company and a thing which hopefully will still be there when they leave again. And they leave again in about 2 years or something. I think it's more important to think about brands in a way of constant improving, in a way of constant development, because then you get a sense of, it's kind of this Sisyphus work where you just use the boulder every day and you try to roll that rock up the hill every day or maybe every year, but then it's highly rewarding and you can see how things change for the better if you follow processes. Most of the people actually don't. That has a whole number of reasons why that isn't the case. Maybe we talk about it today, yeah.
To all of our listeners out there, what should they know about you to understand where you're coming from and how you have the authority to speak about brand, where does this wealth of knowledge come from that you've accumulated?
Wealth of knowledge is well said. Thank you, David. I've just been engaged for the last 13 years in the advertising industry and management consulting, and I think that's time enough if you walk through the industry with open eyes to gain a little bit of insight into what is actually happening. And also, I've been working as a creative strategist and a brand consultant for the last, 7 or 8 years. And before that, I was a social media expert for a lot of things. Gladly, I developed myself a little bit because that was, for me, it was a little bit too small cage, if you know what I mean. I just really like brands. And then I like how you can have an impact on brands if you come from various perspectives. And I did that. Basically, I'm a generalist in the agency world because I've worked in creative agencies and media agencies and digital agencies and social media agencies and whatever. I've seen a lot of different perspectives that go into communications. And then I was always interested, because I'm a strategist, I was always interested in the problems that our clients had. And so I was always looking for bigger problems. And that led me down the road of brand, basically, because at some point, the problems that you have working on a social media account, they are not big enough anymore, because you see that you can't change anything from just the channel view. You have to go one step further. And so you come to a brand point of view at some point. And at some point, you also leave the communication part behind you. That's what I did, at least. So I focused on brand management for the last 2.5, 3 years. And it's been highly rewarding because I've learned a lot from my clients, but also I've learned a lot, maybe what could be improved in the sphere of brand management.
And what could be improved? What are common themes that you see, common patterns of failure, or maybe things that need some improving?
Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot to that. We could talk about this for the next four hours, I would say.
Okay, so give us an overview.
Well, let's start with the most important ones, like what needs to change or what's not working well. I think education in brand management is shit in Germany. Most of the things that I learned on the job, and then I had the luck to have jobs where I got these insights that led me to learn something. But I've seen a lot of people who didn't have the luck to move into jobs where people could tell them about how brands work and what you can do in order to create value for your business. Most of the people who work in marketing and brand management in Germany, at least that's the main market that I've seen, they don't have an impact on business at all. They do the beautiful pictures thing where they do a campaign or two every year, where they produce a ton of content that nobody wants to see, and where they show that stuff to, I don't know, the son or the daughter of the CEO and hope that they like it. If they did a good job. And I think that it's not strategic enough, the education that people get. So it's not the combination of how you create value for business and what you are actually doing there is a huge gap between those things, you know? For example, I was working with an insurance client just 2 years ago, and we were working on these really high level, C-level board thingies in terms of tracking the brands and finding out what the situation in the market actually is and how it looks like. And then at the same time, the people we talk to on client side, the people in brand management, they had to deal with things like, well, we now also need to track different other teams unrelated to marketing in our company and how they use our brand governance guidelines. And we need a long report in order to find out whether that's any good or how we can improve that. And then also they do those big campaigns, where you fly to Cape Town or to Argentina or somewhere to produce like really high-end content. And then the media plan is like, you could have rolled a dice, and it would have been better. And so you can see this very high expectation level from everywhere that those people want to satisfy, and then the lack of possibilities to actually do that, and the lack of tools in order to actually create value, because there's so much nitty-gritty stuff, so much stuff that is small and just gets in the way. And it's if it wouldn't be so sad, it would be pretty hilarious.
That's quite a tough word, but also a really interesting summary from your point of view. You were speaking about moving beyond the individual channels when looking at brand and approaching it more from a sort of managerial point of view. What advantages are within that?
First of all, I think evidence-based marketing research or marketing science, I don't know if you can call it that way. I think it's pretty clear in that it's not the one channel that solves all your problems. It's more human-centered than that, you know? Even if you do a gigantic campaign on Instagram, you will never get all the eyeballs you need in order to grow. At least that's true for most mainstream brands or most brands that have like B2C customership. It's not because most of the people aren't on Instagram. It's just because you will never be able to create those memory structures that you need in order to grow your brand. And so to do anything from a channel perspective is pretty much a dead end. And that's why it's so funny that even in structure, in organizational design, in most companies, you will find that one person who's responsible for a channel. Like in the biggest companies, in the most successful companies, there's some person who does the meta ad manager or something, who sits there and just does the meta campaigns. I think that's stupid. I think it's really stupid because you lose all that insight into what actually works, because you need to compare all the time and you need to optimize your media mix all the time. And then you need to build within your teams the mindset that nothing is ever like the one solution to the problem. And that's what most companies do to their people in the marketing department. Right now, in bigger companies, there is not only the fight between brand building marketers and salespeople. Now we also have the third group of performance marketers who do a little bit of both. And they are now all fighting over who is the most important. And I think that's not really constructive in order to grow a brand. That's why I think it's more important to think in a process and not in fixed silos. Because if you think in a process, then everybody has their part to play within that process. There's just a fixed situation in time where they're more important than others.
Could you go into more detail in how that process can look like and what you mean by that? If I'm someone who's never heard of processual brand thinking, where do I start?
If you want to get into what processes need to look like for brands in order to grow, I think there are several good, resources on the internet you can find. You can go to the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and you will know everything about customer-centric or category-centric metrics that you need in order to understand how a market behaves. You can go to Mark Ritson. He has a good processual thinking as well on what you need to do as a marketer or a brand manager in order to succeed and in order to be better than 90% of the others. And that's the point. You don't have to be the best in the world doing marketing or brand management. You just have to be better than all of your competitors. And actually, I think it's pretty easy if you standardize your process in a way that makes it easier to use heritage knowledge or legacy knowledge. Because most of the time, the people in marketing departments, they leave, they come and go, and you need to save the knowledge of those people. So documentation is one thing. Like, what are we actually doing all the time? What kinds of decision are we making every day? Nobody ever documents anything. I have never seen one single brand who is actually documenting the decision-making processes that they have on a more operative level, not on a strategic one, because that's pretty, that's easy to see what the decisions were because everybody's talking about it afterwards. But the small decisions that you make every day, nobody's documenting it. We should start with that. And then I would like to point out that I think, and it's okay if everybody thinks it's different because it might look a little bit differently for every brand. But I think there are 4 pillars that you need to follow in order to optimize your brand management processes. The first one is analysis, where you have your whole market research and you track the health of your brand and you track the market and how it behaves. You track your own company and what kind of steps it makes forward or backwards or wherever. And you track culture. many people know the 4C framework, or maybe sometimes it's the 3C framework if you don't use culture. But yeah, customer, company, competition, and culture are the 4 things that I think should be tracked by every company. And of course, a bigger company might have 200 people to do that, and a smaller company might have 1 person who does that part-time. That's okay. But if you have a process in order to generate data that you can then use later on, that's fine. And that's also a competitive advantage you can gain if you are in a category where market research is qualitatively low, if you can say it like that. Then it's easier to gain an advantage, because if somebody is the CEO of a smaller company that's in your competitor set and they think market research is stupid, we don't have to do that, well, then there's your advantage.
So let's summarize up to this point. So the first thing you said was document your process so far.
Yes.
And we could go into a whole discussion about why that's not happening. I feel like some people might even have something to say with, if my process is written down somewhere, I'm not special and I might get copied by AI. That's a whole different discussion. But I see that that's very important for the longevity of a brand and how that's a process or part of the process. And then the second thing you mentioned was actually looking at what's happening to my brand and to the market and to the customer and to the culture, and how does that affect things?
Yes.
And now what's the third step?
Yeah, well, I think about documentation as an underlying premise. It's not a step. Documentation is, you have to do that everywhere and at every step. But the first step really is analysis. You have to analyze all the time, and you have to start with analyzing if you know nothing. So if you are a brand manager, you get into a new company, you know nothing because you're not a customer anymore, you're now a brand manager. And so what do you take a look at? You take a look at the segmentation, you take a look at the market research, you take a look at all the 4Cs, and you ask people, well, what do the 4Cs look like here? Because you don't know. And then afterwards, that's also the sheer stupidity of having people apply to jobs they already did before at a competitor, because they think they already know what to do. If you're a brand manager at, I don't know, at Mercedes, and then maybe you get hired to move to Ingolstadt and work for Audi. Oh my God, please God, no. But yeah, if that happens, if a Mercedes-Benz brand manager moves to Audi, do you think they know what they have to do? I think they have no fucking clue. They have no idea what to do, because it's a different brand that looks at the market differently, that has different data, that has different points in that data that it values, that it creates insights out of. And so I think it's really, really not a good idea to think that people who have worked in a category before know everything about it. However, a little bit of category knowledge might be nice if you can gain a competitive advantage, because you can bring in knowledge that you don't have right now, but you then have in the future if you bring somebody in. But yeah, the first step, analysis, it's really the one thing that I would always start with. If I work with a new client, I don't ask them, what are your objectives? I don't ask them, how's the campaign doing? I don't ask them about the budget or anything. I ask them, take a look at your diagnostic measures. What are you actually tracking? How does the market look like in Excel for you? And that's it's a really revealing thing, because sometimes you win a pitch as an agency. That's for all the strategists out there. You win a pitch, the new brand is onboarded in some way. The CMO comes over, to talk a little bit about the brand, and then you ask him or her, what's actually happening in the market? Can we take a look at your brand tracking together? And a good CMO will always say, well, yeah, of course, here it is, and have it with them. But most CEOs will tell you, well, yeah, I have to make a meeting with that market insights team or the data team or something. I haven't spoken to them in months. I have no idea where they even sit. But yeah, let's find a meeting with them and let's talk to them. They can guide you through all the data. I don't really know. That's what most of the time happens. And it's hilarious because the people don't really recognize how it reveals their incompetence. But most of the time it's that way.
And sometimes they even hide behind that's confidential, or we can't tell you that, or I need to check with legal. even though the whole point of having an agency on is to have someone do that with you or for you, right?
Yeah, and it will definitely make problems go away if the ones you hire to solve your problems won't get access to data they need in order to solve the problems. It's dangerous, I think, to work that way. But yeah, you have seen it. I have seen it. Everybody has seen it who works in advertising agency land. And I think it needs to change. Yeah. Data is a really important thing. And most of the time, people throw around data as a word because it sounds, it sounds pretty cool to talk about data. But then they also want to be seen as creatives and not as data nerds. And so it ends somewhere. And I think marketers and brand managers should be real data nerds. They should not be creative at all. They have service people to do that for them. They should be data nerds. And analysis is the first part in the process that always needs to be the first part. Because if you leave that out, everybody else will be just guesswork.
This show is supported by the 30-Minute University of Planning. The 30-Minute University is a free community with over 10,000 marketing experts from all over the world. They facilitate free 30-minute one-on-one mentoring sessions between seasoned professionals and those at the start of their careers. If you are a young professional looking to learn from the best in the business or an expert looking to offer mentorship, search the 30-Minute University on LinkedIn now. May I put an idea into the room which I heard recently, which I found very controversial, but also quite interesting. I'm sure you've heard of Rory Sutherland and his team. And he put forward that a person claiming to have data that proves a certain point might be more dangerous than a person guessing sometimes and having like an intuition, because the data is always believed, but the person having an intuition not. What do you say about that?
Rory Sutherland is right. Let's leave it with that. Rory Sutherland is definitely right. He's an icon. Love his books. But I think that the point that he wants to make is that there should be room for creativity and data should not rule the game. And that is exactly the right thing to say. I'm just thinking that it's important who does the creative work. And the creative work should be done by creative people. And I think by definition, a brand manager should not be a creative person. It should be a person who follows a process and who can, have a stable input and stable impact for the brand that he or she manages. And it's not their job to come up with the best ideas because you have, as I said, you have agencies to do that for you. And it's really important to what Rory says, to be creative and sometimes be a little bit more creative than to follow the data. But it's still important who does this creative work. And I think agencies should do the work all the time, like anytime. However, people don't really know what data means. Like if you go to a brand manager and tell them, what's the most important data you have? Then they will probably say, I don't know, this is our market share in the last half year. And then let's open our dashboard that we built for 200,000 euros. And let's take a look at the social signals or something. And I think Falk, who was also at your podcast, he already said like there is a lack of social metrics and the impact they have on actual business metrics. It just doesn't correlate. It just doesn't make sense. Yet still, in most companies, this is the data you get. There is nobody in there who is thinking creatively about data and who says, let's ask some random people a few new questions, and maybe that's more valuable than connecting 500 different APIs to our Power BI. Just that maybe sometime in the future, maybe in the near future, machine learning will figure out what actually is important to us or not. No, I think it's important to think about it and to actually put some effort into the process of generating data, and then also to know which kind of data is more valuable than others, than other data points. And that's also a thing you could experiment with. Many people are those A/B testing people who say, like, we can experiment the hell out of this. We're just going to put everything out there and then we're going to see what sticks or what's better than the other thing. But that's hugely ineffective and hugely inefficient. And then B, if you don't know what you're looking for, or if you don't trust in academic work to guide you what actually impacts consumer behavior, you're lost. You can do whatever, and you will always have a B version that's better than an A version, but it's going to suck still, It's not going to work anyway. And so also the theoretical framework for what kind of metrics are interesting. Reading a little bit of the South Australian friends from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is nice. How many marketers have read this in Germany? I don't know, 30%?
Few.
Max.
Is it?
It's and that wouldn't be the case in any other part of a company to not look at the newest evidence.
Very, very interesting point, especially also with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. I have my personal view on data, and it involves that no measurement is perfect, and because we're dealing with humans, we're always guesstimating in some way. I feel like people quite often look too much at absolute data and absolute numbers and not enough at relative change and change over time and actually moving the needle in some way. Even if the measuring isn't perfect or the data isn't perfect, moving the needle is something that we as marketers are aiming to do, especially when it ultimately comes to business goals.
You're completely right. And I would also add that even if you move the needle, but on metrics that don't make sense, you're still lost. I have had a very long discussion with people who use the bounce rate and the time spent on a website as a major indicator for success. That was because they were an online shop and they tried to sell stuff. And so it was very important for them that not many people bounce. And then it was very important that people do not spend more time than necessary. So they had like a time frame where they said, well, if it goes below that, it's bad. And if it goes above that, it's bad. But in the middle is just right. And then at some point, they changed the conversion measurement and they found out that what they did was complete bullshit. Like it was really stupid because most of the conversions were below or above their time frame. So what they measured and what they used as a proxy metric was completely wrong. And that was just because somebody had found out in some data set, oh, that might be interesting and that might be valuable to us to look at it that way. And it changed the whole horizon for the company on how to approach this data. And it's a classic example. And I think it happens every day, all the time, everywhere. And you really need to put a lot of effort into it so that it doesn't happen.
Valid point. So we've done the analysis.
Yes. First step.
What's the next step?
Second step is strategy. And strategy is a wonderful word. People love strategy. Strategy sounds like it is the most important thing of all. It's not. Actually, there is not a single definition of what strategy is, which is interesting because if you value something so highly, why is there not a single definition to what it means? And why can everybody say, well, this is what I mean with that, this is what I mean with it? I always use the definition for a strategy that you can find if you just Google it. I think in Germany it's Gabler Wirtschaftslexikon, something like that comes up. And then it says strategy is if you identify a problem, you formulate a solution for that problem, and you implement some measures in order to solve your problem. I think that's strategy. So it's also a process with many parts. But within brand management, if you look at brand strategy services, for example, you find everything. Like really, there are service providers who say they do strategy and they do your TikTok strategy, which is completely fine to write down what you want to do on TikTok. But I think in 99% of cases, it's not strategic at all. Like it doesn't make any sense to say strategy to a document where you point out what you want to do on a certain channel. Yet still, we call it strategy because it gives it a little bit of grandeur. It sounds important. And maybe the boardroom is interested or something. I think within brand management processes, strategy is a very defined set of actions, actually. So you have, first of all, the audience decision making. So you're targeting what kind of people do we want to reach. That's the first part of strategy, because it's not yet a problem, but it is a way to frame where you look for a problem. And most of the time you will find most of the people will say, well, within this demographic, our category entry points are shit, or our funnel data is not good, or whatever they're measuring. So the targeting or the audience is the first part of strategy, because you have looked at the market in step one. So you have a clear sense of what audiences might look like. So that's step two. And then within strategy, within the second step, you do audiences, and then you find a solution for that problem, which is usually in a brand sense positioning. So you do, as soon as you have an audience, you do the positioning. Sometimes people just do positioning without targeting. It's weird to look at some companies who are reaching out to you as an advertising agency, for example, and ask you, well, could you do a positioning? We already looked at everything and we have some ideas and we brainstormed something and here's our Miro board. Could you please make a brand positioning out of that? And you're like, yeah, well, no, who do we want to like us?
I actually had that discussion as well with a recent project, whether coming from the product or coming from the people should be the strategy, should be the first step of thinking about strategy. And it was a really interesting discussion. And in the end, we settled somewhere in between. But you would start with the audience.
Definitely, all the time. Because, well, you could call it customer centricity. I think there is a valid point in academia to be customer centric. I think, except for when it comes to how you approach the measurement of your audiences, because then you can also look at categories first, and then first frame a category and then look at the different audiences. You can do that as well. But if you think about brand in general and your brand management process, you look at the market, and the most important part of the market is the one who gives you money or buys your products. So you should look at that. It just doesn't make sense to look at your product first, because of course you can make a fantastic product, but then if nobody buys it, is it still a fantastic product? I don't know. I've never understood the product-centric view, because I think most of the time it just ends in failure. Of course you can have luck, or you can, maybe you know the market by heart and you just start, researching and developing new products, and because you know exactly what people want. But haven't you then started with the audience still? It's kind of weird to me to first build a product and then look for a market. But anyways, I think it's important to look at the people and then position a brand so that those people you chose like you. It's never a positioning for a generic audience, because I don't know, if a brand comes to you and tells you, we would like to have a new positioning that's more lighthearted and optimistic and for a younger demographic, you would say, well, what kind of younger demographic? Because there's no generations. We talked about that beforehand. There's no generations. So what kind of people would you want to activate for your brand? You have to know that, right? If you don't, then, well, how should we make a positioning? So you have targeting, positioning. The next step is design. I really and honestly think that design is a strategic capability, because you then, if you have a positioning, have to design for that positioning. If you are a lighthearted, optimistic brand, maybe you should look lighthearted and optimistic so that those kind of associations get going in the heads of your consumers. So yeah, that's also a discussion you can have with everybody, because design, it lies somewhere else. It's not part of the process. It's just a way of executing in the end. No, it's not. Design is strategic decision-making. And I think it's important to do it in this part, in the strategic part of your process. And then you have, let's see, I'm going to recapitulate: targeting, positioning, design. And then you have brand architecture, which should be checked every year. I don't think you need to change brand architecture that often, but it's valuable to talk about brand architecture every year and to ask the question, are we still in the right architecture for our brand? And then move on. So it's most of the time, I think brand architecture is a very slow step in the process. And then comes the most important process of strategy, which is setting an objective. And objectives are also a place where you can create value if you do them right. Because most of the time, if you work on service side and you talk to companies about their objectives, they're going to tell you, well, of course, we have objectives. I'm going to tell you, we are going to increase brand love, or we are going to have a higher loyalty rate than 7 of our competitors, or something like that. I'm using some weird objectives to make the point that sometimes they are weird. Those objectives can be better or worse, not only externally to grow the brand, but they can work as a facilitator for your teams and for the internal development within the company, so that everybody knows what are we working on actually. Like, what's the plan? What's the vision for this year? Where do we want to put the brand? If sales know that, if procurement know that, if research and development know that, they are going to work on brand and on strategy. And they are going to be part of that shared mission a company has. And it's going to be so much easier to develop the brand in a certain direction if those objectives are right. And if those objectives are understood throughout the company, and if they kind of cascade down into the personal goals of every single person working at the company. I think American companies do that very well because they work more with these hierarchical constructs of objective setting, like with OKRs and stuff like that. And they are used to it, that somebody at the top gives you a vision and then you have to execute on that mission. It's not so much a German thing, I think, but it's a good thing for brands. It's maybe not such a good thing for the creativity of every single one in the company, because decision-making might get squeezed a little bit in the lower ranks. But yeah, still, it's good for a brand to develop because it makes it united in the vision and in the direction. So targeting, positioning, design, brand architecture, and objectives, those 5 steps make up a strategic brand management process. So the strategy part. I think it's pretty easy to understand. But if you look at what agencies offer, there is so much in there, so much that is not strategic, so much that is just, oh, we also can do that. And now we put strategic in front of it, and then we can, I don't know, raise our prices or something. I've never understood it. But, and now there's the 3rd step, which is tactics. Obviously, after strategy, there's tactics. I think we should not talk about tactics that much in this podcast, because everybody is all the time talking about tactics. This is also a sign of maybe something's not right, because everybody is always only talking about, like, look at that promotion, look at that ad, look at that campaign. It seems like a yearly campaign, maybe a TV commercial, is like the biggest thing that a brand manager can produce.
Isn't?
And I think that's totally not the case. I think it's pretty easy to produce a good TV commercial. Yeah, it costs money. Okay, but it's not that, you don't show your expertise, because a lot of people can do that. And there's like hundreds of people involved in producing a commercial, a good one. Of course, yeah, you have to organize a little bit. You have to get the money to do that, etc. But yeah, this is not the interesting thing. The interesting thing in brand management is to use the whole marketing mix that was proclaimed at some point.
Is the marketing mix part of tactics already, or is it still part of strategy?
Yes. No, it's tactics. The marketing mix, product, price, place, promotion, that's tactics. Because a product from a brand perspective is just a way to satisfy the needs of your consumer. You can change products. You can not so much change brands, but you can change products. You can develop new ones. You can make them better. You can make them, I don't know, faster, whatever. What's the second one? Price?
Yes.
Pricing. I haven't met a single marketer who actually does their pricing. Most of the time it's in some other, I don't know, in the financials department or somewhere. It's weird because it's clear that it should be part of the marketing mix. And the marketing mix is the tactical foundation of what a brand can do in order to grow. So it can create products to serve the needs of their customers. It can do pricing well so that it either sells out or sells nothing. Place, the distribution part of it is really important, especially if you are a retail brand, because you always have to deal with retailers and with other parties that are involved. But maybe that is not the worst part. I think pricing is definitely that should be improved a little bit. And then you have promotion, which is basically 90% of the time of every marketer. And promotion is only one step. Like, you have to do all this analysis part where you do market research in so many different ways. You have to have a really intense way of doing strategy before your fiscal year starts. And then you have to have the product that fits your positioning and fits your strategy. You have to have the pricing that fits the strategy. You have to have the distribution ready. And then comes promotion. Yeah, that's just one lever on top that you have to do. But sometimes it feels like this is all they're doing. And it's really frustrating because it is one lever and it costs a lot of money and it produces interesting visuals and images, but it's not the most important thing. Actually, I would go as far to say that the marketing mix needs another P, and I know a lot of people have done that before, and it's very thin ice where I'm walking here. But I always think there should be a fifth people P.
I agree.
Where you think about, as a brand manager, what does my organization need? How do I get the right people for the job? Because structure follows strategy, right? That's not a new thing to say. And if structure follows strategy, well, then you have to do the structure after you have done the strategy. And so you have to have in the tactical mix something that provides you with a lever to change your organization in a way it helps the brand grow. So yeah, those are the 5 things, like 5 Ps that are in the tactical game.
Would you include process as a sixth one?
Not so much, actually, because everything is a process. And it's a little bit like documentation. I would say documentation is not a single point because you have to do it in every part of your process. And everything is a process, right? So I would say you don't need that. But of course, you can do it however you want. But I have a 4th pillar, which is, I would say, the least sexy pillar of them all, which is called implementation. And implementation is kind of the diplomatic and the administrative stuff you need to do in order to even do the other stuff. Because the first point in implementation is budgeting. And budgeting is also something I have seen to be underperforming quite radically, to be honest. First of all, I have met so many marketers who don't make their budget themselves, who just receive a budget from their financial department, receive a budget from their CFO, I don't know, in a meeting. Okay, yeah, next year you get like what you had last year plus 700K. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And marketers, most of the time, they're like, well, yeah, let's take it. We're going to do something with it. So,
and they need to defend it quite often as well. They're like, oh, this year you had 1% less performance. Now you get 15% less budget or whatever,
Yes. And if you follow the process that I'm proclaiming, if you have a process that starts with data and ends with brand tracking, and in the middle, you have a lot of decision making and you have a structured approach to what you're doing, then funny thing is, you can go to your CFO and say, well, yeah, we lost 1%, but that's due to changes here and there. We have a solution for that, which we're going to implement this year. We're going to need this amount of money in order to generate this amount of revenue. This wording that I'm using, we need this kind of money to generate this amount of revenue, is highly difficult for most marketers in Germany because they don't know. They are not even interested in how much money they are generating. And I would say the one thing that's interesting to me as, I don't know, a person who leads a company is how much incremental revenue am I getting from my marketing department? Because that's the whole purpose of it, right? Most of the marketers don't know. They just don't know. You should ask them, well, what's the incremental gain this year with your strategy? I promise you 95% of marketers will not have an answer. And that's a symptom which is quite serious, I think. There is this good example from Byron Sharp who says, please never use ROAS or ROI as a metric, because in the denominator, if there is a 0, it becomes infinite. So if you don't spend any money on marketing, your ROI is infinite. And who doesn't want an infinite ROI? And that's also a symptom of what you should not track. ROI is not the point in marketing. The point in marketing should be, what incremental value am I generating this year or next year? Or what do I plan to generate next year? It should not be, how can I stay afloat with the same amount of money like every year, or with no money at all. How can I do that? That should not be the case. It should be generate more customers, new customers who use the product for the first
Absolutely,
time.
and it's a very short-term measure as well. It's 4-to-1 campaign when marketing is proven to not work in one campaign, but it's like you build mental availability for in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years to buy a second Coke a year.
Exactly.
Not, in that moment.
Exactly. The second Coke. That's a great example too. Yeah, but implementation, like budgeting, means you need to be aware that you need a huge Excel list of all the measures you're planning to do, of all the costs those measures will have, and of all the incremental revenue that will be generated by these measures over time in the future. And I have not seen once a final plan or a budgeting document from a marketing executive or from a CMO or from whoever who's responsible for that brand and who's responsible for the growth of that brand. But I have not seen once a document where this has been done in the way that the academic work would prescribe it to do it.
Could you maybe give a little intro to what you mean with incremental value, or what is defined as incremental value to someone who's listening?
Yeah, incremental value means value that would not be generated if you would not have the measures in place. For example, one measure next year is a big campaign. So what is the value that you generate by doing this campaign minus the cost, minus the value that would have been generated anyway, even if you didn't do the campaign? So what is the small amount of money that you actually get additionally over what would have happened if you did nothing? I think that's the most important metric for people who work with advertising campaigns, or with expensive advertising campaigns at least, because they need to show it's okay to spend 600, 700, 800,000 euros on a TV commercial, on a new one, because if we don't do it, we wouldn't get another million. But we think we would get another million if we do that. So you have an incremental value of 200,000 euros because you generated 1 million euros in value, but it cost 800,000, so it's 200,000 incremental value that you wouldn't have had if you would have just done nothing.
Brand building is quite a lot about building a mental monopoly. I thought that's quite an interesting idea to think about. It's not about competing necessarily with other brands, but it's competing in the mind. I feel like many brands get that wrong. They say, oh, this brand is a category leader and they do this and this, and we want to show the world that we're better at that.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's not even a bad strategy in some categories, actually. The whole category tracking perspective comes from Jenny Romaniuk and her approach to how you build those mental cues, those mental monopolies, as you called it. I don't think there is a mental monopoly, actually, because mental monopolies would be real monopolies, like actual economic monopolies, because you will always have competition. If you formulate it the right way, you can put airlines and trains and cars into the same category of transportation, for example.
I see. So it's a point of perspective. It's saying what are the alternatives, not saying what are the other companies that produce the same thing as I, or that have the same product.
You can, of course, do it. But I think you need to explore that, because I think there are categories, obviously, where you provide things that are very close to commodities, and where there's not so much brand equity on top of that, so that you could really own the category monopoly-wise.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, sugar is a commodity anyway, but still, in the sugar category, there are different brands that compete, even though sugar is very close to a commodity. But then also think about sweeteners and not sugar. Think about the category entry point could be, I want my coffee to taste sweet, or every time I drink coffee, I think it should be sweetened. Maybe you don't end up with sugar. Maybe you end up with honey instead. I don't know. And you have those, you will never have mental monopolies, I think, unless you are an actual monopoly. And we don't have that many, gladly.
Even if you think about share of mind, because I feel like even if there are different alternatives, they need to be mentally available, right? So Could it be that if it's a monopoly, it will be the only thing that's in your mind?
Well, of course, if you have a monopoly, then like if you are in North Korea, and you want to, and I don't know if they have private car ownership there, but if you want to go from A to B, maybe there's only one alternative and only one thing will come to mind, and you will only have one choice. So it's a lack of choice that makes your mental monopoly happen. So it's an actual monopoly that kind of translates into a mental monopoly, but you won't find that if you move the category ladder. But I think it's a very important thing to think about, because I would like to end this process thing for once, because we had the whole analysis thing, and we are kind of drifting into analysis again. You will see why. We had strategy as a second pillar. We had tactics as a third pillar. And now we're in implementation. And in implementation, we talk about budgeting. We also talk about what does the brand plan look like? Like, how do you document it? How do you put it in a vision for the company? That's the second point. Then there's brand governance. How do I make people do brand safe things and in uniform with our brand and what it wants to stand for? And the very last part of the process is starting anew, is brand tracking. So you have market research as the first point in the first pillar, and then you have brand tracking, which is basically market research, but over time, as the last point in the last pillar. And there's a loop that closes. And that's also why we kind of organically went into research again now, because if you do it that way, and if you handle your brands that way, every year you will know, well, yeah, I will have my strategy calls 9 months after the fiscal year started, because that's when the process tells me there should be a new strategy in the making. And then there's discussions around the strategy and whatever. And as soon as the new fiscal year starts, there should be a budget, obviously, for this fiscal year. And there should be a plan how to use tactics that then start to achieve new objectives for the next year. So you have a process that kind of aligns with the yearly work that a brand manager has to do. And most of the time, this is a lot more chaotic. Well, you can see that strategy is going to be done at most companies in September, because somebody tells them, well, we have a strategy meeting in October with our CEO. We probably get going and do something about that. But you can also use this process and this framework to know what you have to look at, because most brands don't talk about brand architecture for 5 years if they don't have product innovations that kind of they kind of have to where they kind of have to change it, but they should talk about it yearly, and they should talk about it in a structured way. And also about positioning. Well, yeah, sometimes you have a positioning process. It takes half a year. It costs 200,000 euros to produce a new positioning. You then have to communicate it everywhere. You have to do like this internal events and workshops where you explain it to people. And that's, it's hard work. I get it. But then also next year, maybe you have different objectives. Maybe you talk about the positioning again, and then you talk about it again from a new perspective, because you then will know whether your past positioning efforts have done any good and how you can measure that. I think looking at brands as processes to improve corporate value or business value is a very, very important thing, just as a mindset, because you can do your process differently. I'm not a dogmatic person usually. People that know me will agree on that. But you can choose whatever points you want to incorporate into your process. But I think just to follow it as a process solves half the problems. It's really that impactful.
Wow, we've gone through quite the process with this process. I've got a few questions though. One of them is that process. Is it fixed, or should maybe sometimes an aspect be pulled forward because you see that your metrics are going red everywhere and nobody understands what you're doing and maybe you went the wrong way?
Yeah, short-termism is also bad. It's actually a good thing that this process needs to take a year, because you can't incorporate all of the points into a quarter, because we would do that. Because we're so obsessed with quarterly results that we would say, well, let's do that, all of that, what you just said, Michi, but do it in a quarter, because then we are faster than the competition, and that certainly must do any good, right? I don't think that's true. I think there are certain things that you can pick up in the short term. If you have a new product, you put it on the shelves, you will see immediately what happens. And you will have an indication based on past experience with other products. How good is that? Will that work or will it not work? So there are examples for short-term thinking. I highly recommend that you follow a whole year of a process and you follow a whole year of a measurement cycle, because what you actually want to change is the things that are in the minds of the consumers or your customers. You want to change their perspectives on the category. You want to change their memory structures, basically. And that's a thing that is not done from overnight. It is not going to be done within a quarter, too. It is going to be done over a long period of time. And maybe sometimes even a year is not enough. Yet, of course, that will provide you with a new little problem, which is, how do I know if it works as soon as possible? Because you don't. You don't. And I think if you have a measurement in place that looks at what people remember and what people think about a category, then you will find out soon enough what the trend lines are for your brand.
So something like unaided top 3 and recall, unaided recall, aided recall, that sort of stuff? Or maybe
it's also mental market share on certain category entry points that you value enough. Maybe it's that I want to go from A to B, and there's a change in what people think of when they think about visiting their grandma, and the way of transportation changes, to stay with the example that I provided earlier. Maybe that's something. I don't know. I can't, you can't standardize what is important in the head of the consumer. You have to do that for your category, obviously. But yeah, the approach is completely correct. You will find correlations at one point, and you will find indicators that show you whether this is any good or not, what you have at the market or in the market, maybe a little bit earlier than it shows the competition.
Talking about individual experiences, can you recall a time when you were like, oh, a company has gone completely beyond what I expected and has blown me out of the water with the value they provided?
I'm really blown out of the water by every company that doesn't use AI for their customer support. I think there is a valuable human element, because right now when we are recording this, there was just the message that I think Klarna automated 60% of their customer success requests with AI. And I think if you have that many customer requests that can be solved by AI, something else is wrong, actually. And it's not AI that's so great that it can be solved, but the product has maybe flaws that are repeatedly, that you need to get your hands on and change and do something else. But it's not AI that solves your problems. I don't really want to say a brand that really comes to mind because it fascinates me. I think most of the time, brand management is not about the sudden slow spike, the talk of town for a week. I think most brand managers need to work on reliably making their brands grow, getting better every day, even a little bit. And then over time, you will see what huge value can be generated if you just walk the line and if you just stay put and do what you think is right and follow a process. And what I don't like is when, there's a new CMO who comes to a company and then he changes the agency and he does this great work that costs like 500 million euros and everybody's talking about it. And 2 weeks later, everybody forgot about it and nothing changed and he moves on, or she. And that's something that I really despise in this industry, because I don't think it's sustainable from a human perspective. It's not sustainable from a perspective of how to manage brands.
So always the slow burn over the short term.
Yeah. This also leads me to go to brands that have been around for quite some time, I really appreciate the work of companies of conglomerates, like P&G, what Unilever does. In Germany, Dr. Oetker and Wagner, stuff like brands like that are, for most people, seem so generic already because they've been around for so long and they're everywhere, I really tend to like those brands and the work that goes into managing these brands, because you can see that it has been good work because they've been around for a long time. I don't really believe in all those influencer corporations that have their own iced tea right now or something like that. It's going to be that's just phases, That's phases. It's not sustainable value that's being generated for business.
Do you have a big call to action, a thing, a message to the world, to brand managers that you want to get out here today?
Yes. Read more books.
Any specific?
I would love to see brand managers not read esoteric work, but work that has their roots in evidence-based marketing.
Okay. Evidence-based marketing. Thank you, Michi, for being on the show and sharing your idea of how value can be created here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, David.
If you enjoyed the way Michi thinks and want to pick his brain, or potentially even collaborate in introducing processual brand thinking to your business, please reach out to him via LinkedIn. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you push the save or follow button so you don't miss the next episodes. Coming up is one with Ethan Decker from Applied Brand Science, who will debunk some marketing myths on the podcast. See you there and cheers. Psst, you can leave comments on Spotify now.